Welcome to cowdemi.com. Today we're doing a deep dive into something pretty interesting, heat stress in dairy cows. We think about those cows out there just kind of chilling, grazing, and producing all that milk. But it turns out that making all that milk creates a ton of heat. Like they're running a marathon, but wearing a winter coat, even on what we might consider a nice day. Like, oh, this is a beautiful day. But for them, it's like, whoa.
Yeah, it's a different story for them.
The first thing that just blew me away was learning just how much heat a dairy cow produces. I mean, we know they're big animals, but the numbers are kind of wild.
Yeah, the numbers are pretty amazing. A high-producing dairy cow, they're producing a lot of milk every day. That generates a lot of heat. It's equivalent to a person running for hours on end. In fact, if you think about a cow that's producing, say, 120 pounds of milk a day, she's generating almost 20 times more heat than a human who's just resting. So it's a huge amount of heat.
So they're just dealing with this intense internal heat load all the time.
Pretty much constantly.
No wonder they can be susceptible to heat stress.
Right, and that's why understanding their comfort zone is so important. Call that the thermoneutral zone, or TNZ for short. It's basically like a comfort zone for temperature. It's the range where the animal doesn't need to burn extra energy just to stay at a normal body temperature.
Okay, so what's the just right for a cow?
Well, it's interesting because it's much lower than what we consider comfortable. Their ideal temperature range is between 4 degrees Celsius and 21 degrees Celsius. However, it's crucial to understand that temperature alone isn't a reliable indicator of heat stress in dairy cows because it doesn't account for the significant impact of humidity.
And that brings us to a really important tool, I guess you could call it, for understanding heat stress, the temperature humidity index, or THI. Can you maybe break that down for us a little bit?
Yeah, the THI, it's basically like a heat stress barometer for cows. It combines the air temperature and the humidity into a single number, and that number gives us a good idea of how much heat stress the cows are experiencing. It's more useful than just temperature alone because humidity has a huge impact on how well a cow can cool herself down.
So it's really giving us a measure of how uncomfortable it is for the cow, how hot it feels to them.
Right, exactly. It's about how the heat feels, not just what the thermometer says.
What are some key numbers that farmers need to be watching out for?
Well, research has shown that milk production starts to decline when the THI hits 68. So for a cow that's producing a lot of milk, that THI of 68, that's when you start to see a dip in production.
What happens is the THI goes up even more.
Basically, the higher the THI, the worse the heat stress gets. When you hit the 80s, that's serious. And anything over 90 is straight up dangerous. In fact, if it goes above 82, that's an emergency. You got to do something to cool those cows down or they could die. To give you a sense of what that means in the real world, a THI of 68 could be like 22 degrees Celsius with a kind of average humidity.
So we know that cows are super sensitive to heat. And we have this THI tool to help us kind of assess the risk. But how can farmers actually tell if their cows are feeling the heat?
That's a great question.
What are some of the signs they should be looking for?
There are both physiological and behavioral changes that can indicate heat stress.
Okay.
A cow's normal body temperature is around 38.5 degrees Celsius, but under heat stress, it can climb to 40 or even 41 degrees. Another very clear indicator is the cow's respiration rate. At rest, a cow typically takes between 25 and 50 breaths per minute, but when they're heat stressed, their breathing rate increases dramatically. If you observe a cow taking about 1 breath every second, that's a very clear signal that the cow is under significant heat stress, and intervention is necessary. Along with this rapid breathing, you'll often see another sign: excessive drooling or foaming at the mouth. It's partly due to increased saliva production, but also because they're losing so much moisture just from breathing so rapidly. Think about how you might feel after a strenuous workout. You're breathing hard, you might be sweating, and your mouth feels dry. It's similar for a cow under heat stress.
And speaking of sweating, do cows even sweat? We tend to think of them as having those thick coats of fur.
They do have sweat glands. Cows do sweat a little to cool down, but it's not nearly as effective for them as it is for some other animals. Especially when it's humid, panting, that's their main way of dealing with the heat.
And I bet all that panting causes other problems too.
Oh yeah. All that panting means they're producing more saliva and they lose a lot of water through their breath. So staying hydrated becomes even more critical.
What about behavioral changes? What are some things that farmers might notice in their cows' action?
One of the first things you'll see is a decrease in appetite. Well, when it gets hot, cows tend to eat less and drink more. The heat messes with their appetite centers in their brains, so they're just not as interested in food. This can lead to a pretty big drop in their dry matter intake, which is how much feed they're eating. And to make things even more complicated, heat stress makes it harder for them to digest their food, so they're not getting as many nutrients from what they do eat. But while their feed intake goes down, their water intake shoots way up.
That makes sense. They're losing so much water through panting and sweating.
Right. They have to replenish those fluids to stay hydrated and keep their body temperature in check. A cow that's producing milk, she might drink up to 50% more water than usual when it's hot. So a Holstein cow, she might drink 50 to 60 gallons a day during a heat wave, compared to maybe 30 or 40 gallons on a cooler day.
It really emphasizes how crucial it is to make sure they always have access to plenty of clean, fresh water, especially when it's hot out.
Absolutely. Water is their lifeline in these conditions.
Are there any other behavioral adaptations they use to cope?
Yes, you'll often see them seeking out shade or cooler areas. And if shade is limited, they tend to bunch together, unfortunately reducing airflow and potentially making things worse.
So shade management is a critical factor for farmers to consider.
It's absolutely crucial. You'll also see them standing for longer periods rather than lying down, as this helps increase airflow around their body.
It's amazing how even something as simple as how they're standing can be an indicator of heat stress. But I imagine standing for that long must take a toll on them.
Oh, definitely. There's a trade-off there. Standing for long stretches can be tiring, and it can put extra stress on their hooves, but in the short term, staying cool takes priority, so they'll put up with some discomfort to avoid overheating.
They spend less time lying down and more time standing up when it's hot.
Right, that's a key way they try to beat the heat. Standing up allows more air to circulate around their bodies, so they can lose heat more effectively. But one of the long-term consequences of heat stress is increased hoof problems. Standing for long periods puts excessive pressure on dairy cows' hooves, which can lead to more hoof lesions and lameness, typically appearing with a delay of 2 to 3 months. This is why dairies that experience heat stress in the summer often see a rise in hoof lesions in October and November.
It sounds like these behavioral changes can provide valuable insights into a cow's level of
They certainly can, and by understanding these behavioral cues, farmers can take steps to mitigate the effects of heat stress and ensure the well-being of their herd.
Now, I'm curious, how do cows naturally cool themselves down? What are the mechanisms they use to regulate their body temperature?
So cows have 4 main ways to exchange heat with their environment. They call them radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. So starting with radiation, a cow can lose heat to cooler surroundings, like the night sky. Even on a warm day, the coolness overnight can provide some relief. And then we have conduction, which is the transfer of heat to a cool surface. Imagine the difference between lying on hot asphalt versus cool grass. You cool down much faster on the grass because it conducts heat away from your body more efficiently. So for a cow, lying on cool ground can help them regulate their temperature.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, what about convection?
Convection is all about air movement, like a breeze or a fan carrying away heat. That's why good ventilation in barns is crucial. Fans can really make a difference.
And lastly, evaporation, which we briefly discussed earlier when covering the physiological signs of heat stress.
Evaporation is cooling through sweating and panting. Think about how you feel cooler when you sweat, and that sweat evaporates from your skin, but I imagine it's not as effective on a humid day, right?
Yeah, because the air is already saturated with moisture.
It's like trying to dry a wet towel in a steam room. It's just not going to happen efficiently.
So a hot and humid day is kind of a double whammy for a cow.
It is. It makes it much harder for them to cool down.
This is really insightful. It's incredible how much we can learn by just trying to understand how a cow interacts with her environment.
It really is. And it highlights how important it is to design barns and management practices that work with these natural cooling mechanisms.
We've covered a lot of ground today, going from understanding the science of heat stress to recognizing the signs that a cow is struggling. It's really eye-opening to see how sensitive these animals are to heat and humidity.
It is. It's something we need to be mindful of, especially as temperatures continue to rise.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a truly enlightening conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And a huge thank you to all of our listeners for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something new and that you'll continue to explore this fascinating world around us. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.